The last time ice covered 1/3 of Earth's land surface, the average global temperature was roughly 6 degrees Celsius colder than today. 6 degrees. That gap, in geological terms, is the difference between the world you know and a world where glaciers 2 kilometers thick press down on what is now London, Chicago, and Montreal, compressing the bedrock beneath them by hundreds of meters under their own mass. This was the Pleistocene, specifically the last glacial maximum, which peaked approximately 21,000 years ago. And humans were alive for it. Not just alive. They were hunting, building shelters, tracking mammoth herds across frozen steppe, and in some cases producing art so refined it still stops researchers cold when they encounter it in firelit caves in southern France and northern Spain. The Lascaux paintings date to roughly 17,000 years ago. The people who made them lived in an environment where the January temperature on the Iberian Peninsula could drop to minus 20 degrees Celsius, and where the nearest tree line was hundreds of kilometers to the south. To understand what that life actually demanded of the human body and mind, start with the wind. During the last glacial maximum, the Laurentide ice sheet over North America and the Fennoscandian ice sheet over Europe created their own persistent high-pressure systems. Cold air sank off the ice domes and spread outward in katabatic flows, generating surface winds that were both colder and more sustained than anything typical of those latitudes today. The periglacial zones, the strips of land immediately south of the ice margins, were not forested, sheltered places. They were open, wind-scoured, and largely treeless. Permafrost began within a meter of the surface. The soil could not absorb water. It could not be dug easily. Building anything below ground required tools and sustained effort in temperatures that would, by modern medical standards, produce frostbite on exposed facial skin within minutes at wind chill. The human groups who lived in these zones adapted through accumulated knowledge, not biology. Anatomically, you were not meaningfully different from a person standing on the Russian plain 20,000 years ago. Your core body temperature requires a narrow band between 36 and 38 degrees Celsius to maintain organ function. Below 32 degrees core temperature, fine motor control begins to fail. Below 28 degrees, cardiac arrhythmia becomes probable. The cold does not negotiate. Your ancestors knew this, not in clinical language, but in the bone-level competence of people who had watched the unequipped die. Clothing was the primary survival technology, and the archaeological and genetic record suggests it was far more sophisticated than laypeople tend to assume. Genomic studies of body lice, specifically the divergence point of clothing louse lineages from head louse lineages, place the origin of sewn clothing at somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years before present. By the last glacial maximum, Eurasian hunter-gatherers were producing fitted, layered garments using bone needles, fine enough to thread with sinew and create close-stitched seams. A loose layered fur robe loses its insulating properties when wind penetrates it. A sewn, fitted outer layer traps a dead air layer against the skin, which the body then warms. The difference in survival time in sub-zero conditions between the two approaches is not marginal. It is the difference between hours and days. Shelter followed the same logic. In the absence of wood, which was scarce across the treeless periglacial steppe, groups in Central and Eastern Europe constructed shelters from mammoth bone frameworks covered in hide. Archaeological sites in Mezherych, Ukraine, dated to approximately 15,000 years ago, contain the remains of structures built from over 100 mammoth bones each, arranged as interlocking arches and wall foundations. The interiors, when analyzed for microremains, show evidence of central hearths, insulating floor materials, and spatial organization. These were not improvised windbreaks. They were engineered environments, built by people who understood that the primary enemy was not the cold itself but the body's inability to generate heat faster than the environment extracted it. The caloric arithmetic of Ice Age survival was relentless. In extreme cold, the human body increases its basal metabolic rate to sustain core temperature. A person engaged in sustained physical activity, hunting, carrying loads, building, in minus 15 degrees Celsius conditions with wind chill, may require between 4,000 and 5,000 calories per day. The modern average is roughly 2,000. That gap had to be closed through fat, not lean protein, fat. The hunter-gatherer groups of the periglacial zone were not subsisting on a varied diet of gathered plant materials and occasional game. Much of the year, the land offered nothing to gather. They ate large mammals, and they prioritized fat tissue so specifically that kill sites show systematic processing of bone marrow as a dietary staple. Bone marrow is roughly 90% fat. Starvation in that environment did not look like slow wasting. It looked like the absence of fat intake, which accelerated the metabolic demand for heat, which accelerated the body's consumption of its own reserves, which ended quickly. Social cohesion under these conditions was not incidental. It was thermodynamic. A group of humans sharing a sheltered space generates combined body heat that a single person cannot replicate alone. Cooperative hunting of megafauna, mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, required coordinated effort across multiple individuals, which required communication, trust, and the distribution of cognitive labor. The archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic shows a proliferation of symbolic objects, personal ornaments, and long-distance exchange networks. None of this is decorative noise. Objects that traveled hundreds of kilometers between groups indicate maintained social relationships across large distances, and maintained social relationships across large distances meant access to resources, mates, and knowledge during the seasonal and multi-year fluctuations that characterized Ice Age climate. Because the climate did fluctuate. The last glacial maximum was not a single frozen plateau. It was punctuated by rapid oscillations called Dansgaard-Oeschger events, warming episodes that could raise temperatures over Greenland by 10 degrees Celsius in as few as a few decades, followed by returns to glacial cold. These events, recorded in ice cores extracted from the Greenland ice sheet by researchers at the Niels Bohr Institute and other institutions, show that Ice Age humans did not live in a static environment. They lived in a climate that shifted within human lifetimes. Species ranges contracted and expanded. Water sources appeared and vanished. The social and technological infrastructure that kept a group alive in one configuration could become inadequate in a single generation. The groups that persisted were the ones that accumulated and transmitted knowledge faster than the environment changed around them. Shelter construction, clothing technique, hunting strategy, seasonal migration routes. The location of flint outcrops across hundreds of kilometers of ice margin landscape. None of this was written down. It was carried in human memory, transferred person to person across decades, and tested against outcomes that were, in the most direct possible sense, lethal when wrong. 21,000 years later, the glaciers are gone. The mammoth is gone. The periglacial steppe of Central Europe is under wheat fields and highways. The ice that once pressed 2 kilometers deep over the Scottish Highlands left behind a landscape of lochs and moraines that today appears ancient and permanent. It was formed in a few thousand years and has been gone for roughly 10,000. In geological time, the entire span of recorded human civilization, every city, every empire, every written word, fits inside the warming period that followed. The cold that shaped the cognitive and social architecture of our species is not history. It is the water the fish swam in, and we are still, in every neurological and social sense, the fish.